Welcome to the S&W The Pulse podcast, the sports and media show which covers everything from legal matters to tax liabilities. I'm Pete Fairchild, tax partner and head of the sports, media and entertainment team here at Smith & Williamson. And joining me, as always, for all of our podcasts is our dear friend Ed Dewar.
Pete.
Good afternoon, Ed. Ed, of course, is a former professional footballer and is now a general advisor to sports people. And joining us today to talk about legal issues pertaining to family matters is Manisha Hurchurn from Mackrell, an associate at that particular firm. Good afternoon, Manisha.
Absolutely.
And she's also joined by Mo Pasricha, another associate from that firm, who I'm sure will chip in with these two pennies as appropriate. Hello. Thank you so much both for coming in today. Manisha, would you just like to perhaps just give us a couple of minutes about Mackrell's as a law firm, what you get up to, areas of speciality,
Sure.
sorts of clients you deal with, etc.
All right, so essentially we are a full service law firm. We're situated near Covent Garden, so we're West End Central. We also have an international platform called Mackrell International, and that connects us and our clients to a global network of lawyers worldwide. So most of our clients are international in one way or the other, so it's very easy for us to connect them to lawyers, in different jurisdictions within, let's say, 24 hours and get a joined up approach. So in terms of our clients, obviously we're here to talk about athletes today. So we do represent a lot of footballers. Mo in particular deals with athletes across the board, but that does then spill out into our other departments. So me and the family team dealing with their family law issues. They might be buying property, they might have litigation going on, and they might even have corporate or commercial needs.
We could spend hours, half a day, several days talking about
Absolutely.
the intricacies of family law. Clearly, on a podcast facility, we can only really sort of do no more than scratch the surface.
Yeah.
But what I was proposing to do was just to sort of perhaps put a couple of scenarios to you and just sort of get your steer as to what your initial guidance might be.
Mm-hmm.
So hopefully, having consulted with Mo, and we've got all the players' contractual side bolted down, and we're totally understanding of all what that involves and what income is going to be produced, we're now sitting here as a, let's say for argument's sake, a 23-year-old player, and we've now got some great contracts in place producing enormous amounts of income, and I'm currently living on my own. Is there anything you can do for me at this moment in time?
Absolutely, so much. So first of all,
I'd love to hear it.
Let's do it. So first of all, I think what the guys have said about footballers being in a bubble scenario and being untouchable, I think when it comes to family law issues, they realise very quickly that that's just not true, and you cannot live in a bubble. So going from having everything done for you and having someone dealing with tax and finances and wealth managers to then having to look at your own assets, because you might be getting divorced, you might be thinking of moving your partner in, you need to know for yourself how that all works out for you. So for instance, you've got a 23-year-old, great contract, money's coming in, haven't moved the girlfriend in yet, but want to. There's discussions, it's all sort of like moonlight and roses right now. But
I know that before.
you have now, Eddie. Free to use it. But you're moving your girlfriend in, you're potentially earning, I don't know, millions. We're talking in terms of millions.
Potentially.
You've got a massive house, etc. It might be mortgage free, I don't know. And you might think that, well, I'm just moving my girlfriend in, that's absolutely fine, everything stays the same. Well, that's not the case, particularly when, there is somebody who your partner isn't earning as much as you are, doesn't have a place of their own, let's say, and you're saying to her, this is your home, it's as much yours as it is mine, you can do whatever you want here, this is 50-50, doesn't matter that it's just my name on the legal deeds. All of those things can, at one point, if things do explode, lead to giving your partner some sort of interest in your property.
Is that coming back to almost like the verbal agreement that Mo talked about earlier on?
Yeah, and I mean it's more than an agreement because you're not agreeing that you're giving your partner rights, but you are giving them the impression that they have rights.
So sorry, Manish.
Yeah.
If I choose to, or a player choose to bring a girlfriend into the property, is there enough to say that player's girlfriend will be entitled to a piece of that house, is that correct?
No, not straight off the bat. I'm talking about...
What's the time period?
There's no time period. Okay. It's all about the impression that you give your partner. So if you say, look babe, this is your house, okay? I know it's just my name on the house, but we're 50-50 all the way here. Everything I have is yours, blah, blah, blah. And she then relies on what you've been telling her to her detriment, okay? Then she might say, but you led me to believe this was my property too. I've got nowhere to go now. We're talking about the end of the relationship when this would come into play. But then you have given her that impression that she does have an interest. It's not a legal interest, it's what we'd call a beneficial interest. But if she has nowhere else to go and she's been living there for 10 years and you've been saying to her every other week, this is your house, of course it is, we're 50-50 all the way on this, of course you know that you can stay here forever. What would you expect the courts to do to this lady who at the end of a 10-year relationship, you're saying to her, on your bike, off you go.
Okay.
You know? So that's why laws have developed, or case law has developed, and family law has developed to try and put in place agreements. So you've got a cohabitation agreement. So if a footballer, our 23-year-old, is thinking about moving his girlfriend in, it would be very, very wise to consider entering into, or at least taking advice on entering into, a cohabitation agreement. Because... Would
that be similar to a pre-nup, or is that different?
It's similar to a pre-nup, but it's not obviously a marriage situation, it's just a cohabitation situation. Right. But you are recording your intentions at the time of moving in together. So the cohab agreement would obviously say in his favour, she's moving in here, but that doesn't give her any legal right to my property. It doesn't give her any legal right to my property on the breakdown of the relationship. You know, they can be very, very specific in terms of whether that person can move things in the house or bring pets into the house. So it's something to seriously consider when you are a footballer in the limelight earning a lot of money.
So supposing you're the legal representation for the other side, what tactics might you try and deploy to sort of get some rights? I'm just find that quite fascinating.
You can't get the rights unless, you know, the person with the legal interest is giving you the impression that you will have rights. So
unless you can say, therefore, we had this conversation over a candlelit dinner 3 weeks ago where you said basically this is mine as much as it is yours.
Exactly.
You don't have much room for negotiation.
But it can't just be a one-time thing. You've got to give them the impression over time that this is their home forever, potentially. So on the breakdown of a relationship, you know, where is she going to go? And with what money, you know?
So she would also be entitled to taking some of the players' money as well?
No, so this is in relation to land.
To land, okay.
To land and property specifically. Right. So, you know, she would be saying that I have a beneficial interest in this property. And, you know, it can go all the way through the courts where, you know, she might ask that the property is sold and she gets a proportion of the proceeds of sale because she needs somewhere to live.
Sorry, she could ask for the property to be sold because she believes that the athlete has given her that impression.
Right, and this is the reaction that, you know, I get because people don't really know this.
No.
You know, just people generally, you know, a misconception on the street is that there's still common law marriage. That just doesn't exist, you know. So I'm a common law wife, I've got the same rights as a legal wife. That's not true whatsoever. So there isn't this knowledge and awareness out there in society about the rights that you may or may not have as a cohabiting couple as opposed to a married couple.
Yes.
But yes, if it were, let's say, a 15-year relationship and she's done everything in the house, and even more so if she's financially contributed to a kitchen extension, a loft extension, you know, thousands and thousands of pounds. Yeah. But she doesn't have anywhere else to go at the end of this relationship, then yes, she could take that to court and either force a sale or try and get a lump sum, you know, reflecting, her beneficial interest in that property.
That is so interesting because I never knew that.
Yeah, and people
Did you read?
I think we're all learning things here. So, for example, another scenario: one party to the relationship has bought the other one an engagement ring, and then the relationship breaks down. Who's got ownership of the ring?
It's a gift. So this is quite technical. If it's given to you as a gift, technically that's yours to keep. If there's going to be a dispute over, I want that engagement ring back, we wouldn't generally get into that with a couple in terms of a legal perspective. We would say, well, what was the intention? You know, was that a gift to her? Do you really want that ring back? And if they say yes, then it takes it more into the civil remit of law.
Right.
So we don't normally face that kind of an issue. Normally, you know, the ring's been taken off and thrown back in the face anyway.
At that point, have your ring and your kitchen.
Yeah. Chuck it in the river, no one's going to get anything.
So when, in this scenario where we've got our 23-year-olds, perhaps moved the girlfriend in, and now we've moved on a couple of years, and say that they're 25, 26, and all of a sudden she announces that she's with child, what sort of advice would you be able to provide now?
Quick run for the hills. Something like that.
That is very cynical. Children are a gift.
Yes, of course.
Well, there isn't any immediate family law advice that you would need in terms of your rights, etc. Once the child is born, obviously, if they're still a family unit, then everything's fine. No one needs to consider getting legal advice. But let's say the relationship then breaks down and the child stays with the mother. So our footballer in this scenario obviously wants to see his child. Two things I would think about. Number one, child maintenance, and I'll probably talk about that more. Number two, child arrangement. So how is he going to regularise his time with that child? So child maintenance is very, very significant to footballers who are earning a lot more money than the average person in society. So in this country, we do have the child maintenance service that's set up to regulate the payments of child maintenance. But they have their own formula that they apply, and it's based on gross income. So there is a cap of a gross annual income of £156,000 per annum, and that's the total amount that the CMS will look at. So if you've got a footballer earning millions, on top of the CMS calculation, a mum could go through the family courts to get a top-up of child maintenance, and that can be very, very significant. So that is an application that is made actually under the Children Act in the family courts, and included in that application can be, you know, you can ask for things such as a house for this child and the mum to live in, a car for the mum to drive the child around in, you know, a lump sum to pay off her credit card debts or to furnish this house. Now, the difference is it's not for the mum, it's for the benefit of the child. So, for instance, if our 23-year-old had another house spare sitting around, he could sign that over to her or just allow them to live there, but it will go back to him once the child reaches 18 years old or 21 if they go to university. So those applications are for the benefit of the child rather than for the benefit of the mum.
Strikes me that there's a lot of mental issues here, because if you've got the footballer who's fallen out with his intended wife, there may be animosity involved, and he's sitting there, rightly, having to pay thousands of pounds of maintenance every month to someone he doesn't like very much. So presumably the softer skills of what you do come to the fore as well.
Absolutely. I mean, as a family lawyer, I would say first and foremost, you have to have empathy. If you don't, you're going to have a hard task being a family lawyer. If you have sympathy on top of empathy, absolutely great. But what you need to realise, especially with athletes, footballers, as Mo said, you need to take a holistic approach to that. So as well as having the empathy, understanding all of the other elements that might come into why there has been a breakdown in a relationship or a marriage, such as addiction, you know, other things that we see. We have a mutual client, Pete, and you know, luckily things have worked out okay for him. He's managed to settle it, but dealing with his mindset, dealing with the bubble that he thought he was still in, seeing the kind of, you know, how he derailed himself essentially, and just having the awareness and acquiring the skills to navigate everything that they're going through on a personal and emotional level, that is part of the job, and especially so with footballers.
So can I ask, what if the player doesn't have that money or is not earning that level of money he once was. Where does that leave him in terms of maintenance and things like that? Have you ever come across any cases like that?
Yeah, well, maintenance will always be calculated on what you're earning.
Right.
So it's never going to be you were once earning 10 million.
Right, okay, so where you are now.
Yeah, of course,
Okay.
absolutely, that's only fair.
Do you have to go back and get a new order, or how is it reviewed?
So if you're only doing it through the child maintenance service, they will just recalculate. You give them the information and they recalculate.
And the top up from the court?
The top up from the court, I mean, if that footballer was no longer earning that amount, yeah, he would have to go back to court and ask for it to be amended.
So you have to pay fees to go back to court, and if you move from a very well known football club to, I'll take on Manchester United to Sunderland example, then you'd have to go back and ask the court to look again at the maintenance.
Otherwise, he'd be in breach of a court order. So,
Okay. And these go on until, I think you said, potentially
18
21.
or 21, yeah, if the child's going to university.
Yeah, and we see a lot of, just picking up on a few things that Manisha talked about, we see that the mental health point is massive. I think we're starting to see that in sport coming out in terms of the conversation over the last 2 years, 3 years maybe. There's a lot more conversation to be had. I don't think it happens enough. But I think there's so many other issues that I see when I'm working with Manisha's team that they have to deal with a professional athlete. Loans they may have made, investments they may have made, the gambling addictions. Gambling addictions, for me, I've seen, they have a lot of time, and this is why a lot of these addictions
a lot of money.
Yeah, and other relationships that they may have conjured up and had and past relationships that come to the fore at the end of their relationship, with everyone looking for their penny's worth. So we see a lot of that starting to playing with when they unfortunately come to the situation of either their relationship breaking down. A lot of it all seems to happen at once for them.
Yeah.
All of these things seem to come up at once, which I don't know if that's something you guys have seen before, but it just generates this.
No, definitely. I think so. It would definitely be cheaper and better at the embryonic stage to sit down with someone like yourself, and say, right, this is my situation. How do you advise?
Yeah.
And when you're in this kind of space, do you have both couples in, or is it just like normally? Would it be the athlete and his family coming in to see you?
Yeah.
Or is it like?
No. So generally, you are only acting potentially for one partner, so you can't have the other sit in and listen to the advice.
Right.
So yeah, it's normally that one party with a friend or a family member or an agent or whoever they want to bring into the meeting. To sit down and strategize, because that's really important.
Because I've only ever had this case once in my time I've been doing this, where it was a situation where player has met girl, and now player decides to marry this girl, and the player's at the height of his game, earning a fortune, and my first advice to him was, knowing the circumstance and how it all came about, was, I think you might need to go and see someone. And I can remember, like it was yesterday, that put a real strain on our relationship, even to the point of where I'm godfather to his kids, but me delivering that message to his now love of his life put a massive strain in our relationship. Yeah. So how does one navigate that situation?
It's a really tricky situation, and obviously you're talking about getting advice in terms of a prenuptial agreement.
Yeah.
And I think the reason why it is still so difficult in England is because it is not part of our legal framework as yet. Okay. So more and more people enter into them because there is very good case law that supports them at the right stage. But we are a little bit behind in terms of, Europe and America, for example, where it's all legal, a prenup's legal, so everyone is comfortable with that conversation. So I do say to clients who say to me, well, how am I going to break this to my partner? And I have to say, you know them better than me. The best thing to do is say that one of your advisors has had this conversation with you. So put the blame on us. I know you took the blame in that scenario.
Yeah, that's right.
That you were very close to the situation. But, just say you have a team of advisors. They've said to me, I need to think about this because I am who I am and I do what I do. And that's the best way, because yes, it's very unromantic, but we're going into 2020 and prenups are legal around the world, and at some point they will be in England too.
Right. Yeah, because I think for me that is the hardest conversation to have with a client. Your partner's not right for you. or maybe get a prenup or get some sort of arrangement done between yourselves, because essentially what you're saying is that your relationship's going to crash and burn. But just make sure you got your seatbelt on, you know? And that's what you're saying.
Yeah, I think the conversation is so tough. Like, we see those conversations starting to happen, but I think one of the things that tends to help is having that conversation, as you said, maybe as planting the seed as early maybe as possible that these things exist.
Yeah. Correct. And I think the new wave of footballers are quite easier to deal with that now.
Yeah.
I think the new wave of, my generation of footballers was, what are you talking about? That's my missus, and, you know,
It never happened to me.
yeah, it would never happen to me. She's great, she's this, she's that, and the third. 9 times out of 10, he's the one to blame for the breakdown, but he's still going to be in for it, you know? Yeah. But what I'm saying is, I think the newer generation of players, what I've found is easy. It's so easy. You know, we've got a young player at the moment that is being touted by, you know, or being looked at by all the best clubs at the moment, here and in Europe. But to sit down with his mum and dad and say, well, you know what, I actually think you need to do this. I'm able to do that, and is received in such a way that it's like, yeah, all right, cool. It's, you know, it's normal now. Where, like I said, in my time, there's like, you know, you're going to sit there and say to me that you want me to sign this? That ain't happening. Yeah. And all of a sudden, you know what you're doing is right, but because of your relationship and emotional attachment to this person, it goes wrong. It goes wrong, and I think that's the biggest change I've seen. I think players now are more savvy. They know their value in terms of what they bring to the table, and I feel that it's always a case that I always say to a player, if you go and bring this to your partner and she has a problem with it, then don't go through with it. That's my own personal view, because if she loves you, she'll love you when you're both broke.
I mean, I've had to give that advice too. You know, if they don't want to enter into something, does it suggest something to you about their intentions? Yeah. But at the end of the day, I look at it from a legal point of view, so I try not to interfere too much into, you know, the personal relationship, because that's
such a fine line, isn't it?
It is, but that's why it's better for the advice to come from a lawyer rather than an agent who might be, you know,
have an invested
step
interest.
Too close. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that definitely was a massive learning curve for me.
Good.
And in 2 minutes, what is a prenup precisely, and how does it, apart from the timing difference that's obvious, is it completely the same as a post-nup?
No, so a prenuptial agreement is obviously before you get married, and it is a contract. Now, it's a binding contract, but it's not binding in terms of our laws yet. However, it is a contract and it shows good intention, and if you satisfy all of the criteria tick boxes that a Fancy Law Commission report said that would validate a prenup, then they stand up more often than not. The difference to a post-nup is obviously that is an agreement you enter into post-marriage, so perhaps you didn't think about it pre-marriage, perhaps there wasn't enough time to enter into the prenup because one of the criteria tick boxes is at least 28 days before the wedding. You know, you can then do it after the wedding, and actually if you do it as a post-nup, because you are then married, it makes it more of a contract than the prenup.
Right. But will it still have the same value?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, as long as it's all done properly, both parties have been advised to take independent legal advice, and there's no duress, etc., and it is fair, then, you know, they will stand up when the time comes for them to be looked at.
Interesting.
Very good.
Very good.
And when is it? Is there a time when you would say it's ideal to consider making something like a will, or can you be too young to have a will?
No, not at all. I mean, if you're looking at a footballer, and Mo and I discussed this earlier, obviously the drawing up of a will is the remit of a private client lawyer, but in the work that we do, you know, for example, if I was just anybody that's getting divorced, I would say, if you are getting divorced, you need to review your will, because, you know, if you don't have a will, everything will pass to your spouse under the rules of intestacy, and if you hate them now, you don't want them to, you don't want everything to pass to them. So
it's quite persuasive, isn't it?
Review your will, or if you don't have one, for God's sake, get one done. And then Mo was talking about it, of course, from inheritance tax, etc. perspective as well.
So I think the importance of getting like the will in place, obviously, we have our own separate private client team that come in and work with us on this quite regularly with athletes is making sure that you're going to decide who's going to deal with your estate if the worst comes to happen. And also there's lots of gifts and exemptions you can use under the rules out there, which a will can utilise, which you wouldn't be able to use if you didn't have a will in place. And also you don't want to make, if someone who's in charge of your estate and that's your loved one, and they're unable to deal with it because they're so traumatised by the loss of that individual, they may not be the right person to administer the estate. And these estates can be huge. We're talking about athletes which may have huge property investment portfolios. The pension is big, the wealth managers come on board, say they're properly advised by everything we've spoken about today, the right contracts in place. These can be quite intricate structures and may even have an image right structure attached to it. We need to really think about who is the right person, either a lawyer or an accountant, who should be appointed as the executive of the estate if that should happen. I think it's a very grown-up conversation to have, and speaking from someone who hasn't got a will, probably should get a will, it kind of reaffirms the idea that actually you need to make sure you're thinking about planning for the future. The inheritance tax element is interesting, and we've got specialist inheritance tax planners that look at this from an athlete's perspective. And we have one of our private client lawyers. He dealt with some very elite athletes and footballers actually into the 90s and 2000s, and the trusts that he's kind of set up were discounted gifts trusts. So, and these are all based on, as you'll know, the health and age of these athletes, and you can take advantage when you're a young, fit, and healthy athlete and of the discount you're afforded on your tax liability. So it gets very complicated, but I think ultimately, if an athlete is not getting, in the first instance, just a will, to have the conversation about how they then plan their inheritance tax in the future, and they're missing out and potentially paying 40% to the government through the IHT. So I think there's an element here about just, as with everything we've spoken about today, just planning it right and having the right advisor around you to make sure you're kind of well equipped, not just for life in football, but afterwards.
Well said. And I think you've just set your agenda for your homework tonight in terms of position with your own will. I think that is a neat place to draw a line and conclude matters, and I think closing remarks from me would be just to repeat some of the things that have been said that are worth emphasising. Devil in the detail, as been mentioned several times from a legal perspective. Early engagement with proper advisors, underline the word proper advisors, who you've vetted and have seen and checked the credentials for. But as I say, I repeat, I talk as a tax practitioner, but from a layman's perspective in terms of the legals, that was fascinating. Brought it to life. So, Mo, thank you so much. Manisha, ditto that. That concludes our episode today on matters that are legal pertaining to professional sports people. Thank you, Ed Dewar, as always, for joining us and your valued contributions. And thank you so much to our listeners for tuning in. All references and links spoken about in this episode can be found in the episode show notes. Never miss an episode. Please subscribe to our show. If you haven't already done so, please rate and review us in the App Store. Until next time, thank you for listening.
This S&W The Pulse podcast is of general nature and is not a substitute for professional advice. No responsibility can be accepted for the consequences of any action taken or refrained from as a result of what is said. The views expressed are not necessarily those of the presenter or of Smith & Williamson or any of its affiliates. No reproduction of this podcast may be made in whole or in part for professional or recreational purposes. No action should be taken based on this podcast, and we accept no liability if we change your views on any of the subjects mentioned.